Welcome to Next to Madison, a podcast to help you live your best life.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Next to Madison. On today's episode, this is episode 106. I am sitting down with the founder of a nonprofit that is doing amazing work regarding human trafficking, and especially with children, child trafficking. And she's going to talk to us about this and kind of how she got involved and what her organization is doing to help put an end to this horrible and just repugnant crime that's going on that has always been around, but we are starting to finally hear more about it. And as much as it's one of those topics that don't click stop, don't not listen to this, it's something that people want to turn a blind eye to because it just seems so unfathomable that this actually happens. But the truth is, it's important for people to be aware, because you could be one that ends up recognizing it and saving somebody. And so please continue to listen. This is a very important but sensitive topic. So I'm gonna bring on my guest, who's gonna kind of share her involvement and how she got involved and what they're doing today to save our children. So with that being said, I'm gonna bring on my guest on Next to Madison. I'd like to welcome Jessica Munoz. How are you?
Great. How are you doing?
I am good. Thank you so much for coming on the show to bring awareness to this. And we're finally starting to hear more about it in the media. I feel like the media really kind of shut this topic down for so many years. And I have many theories as to why. But let's just get started with how you got involved with your nonprofit.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you again for having me on your show. I really appreciate this opportunity. What I found in my 12 years of doing this work is it really takes one conversation at a time and planting those seeds. It is a tough issue that a lot of people don't want to talk about. Yet the longer that it lives in the darkness, the more kids will be victimized. And so 12 years ago, I started seeing kids come into our emergency room, and we weren't recognizing them as victims of trafficking or exploitation. So all my background's in pediatric trauma. I'm a nurse practitioner, and I couldn't believe that we had this issue. And yet it wasn't like it was being taught when I was in school or anything like that. And, I've been taught all about child abuse and sex assault, but never the fact that American children were bought and sold for sex on a daily basis. And so, I didn't really know a lot of people at the time. I'd only been in Hawaii for a few years. And so I just started having conversations and talking to people in the juvenile justice and child welfare system, saying, hey, I think I'm seeing something. What is this? And at the time, there really wasn't a lot of understanding of this issue, not just in Hawaii, but nationally. I mean, there really was not a lot of conversation around American children being bought and sold.
So what were you seeing exactly that raised a red flag in your mind?
So oftentimes kids would come in with fake IDs or with stories that really didn't match up with either the symptoms they were presenting with or like the trauma signs that they had. They might come in with either with their trafficker or what they were claiming as a boyfriend, which was a much older guy. They'd come in with other girls, which were likely from the stable of girls that a trafficker often has. I also had kids come in with their parents who, again, their stories were not matching up. Kids that would come in with child welfare, like CPS workers for placement, or with law enforcement because they were just, picked up off the street. And yet we weren't asking, well, what were you doing when you were on the run and who was taking care of you? Yeah. And so it really stemmed from just starting to ask a lot more questions and just having that sense in your stomach where you're like, something doesn't seem right here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Oh my gosh. And so,
yeah. And
so then at that point
I started reaching out to those in the social service, law enforcement sectors, trying to find out like what is the response? How are we supposed to be addressing this? Who are we supposed to be calling? And at the time there wasn't a lot that was specific to, again, reporting this issue because there wasn't a true understanding of how complex it was, but also how prevalent it was. Because again, it often gets hidden as they label kids as truants, delinquents, runaways, substance users. And in fact, really what's happening in their life is they're being exploited and trafficked. But it's been a thing that we haven't talked about as a society. And until recently, in the last few years, when, the Epstein scandal was exposed, you started seeing, oh my goodness, there's so many people that are wrapped up in this, and powerful people that are buying children for sex. If we didn't have people buying, we wouldn't need to sell kids.
How do you think mentally, like, why people are so sick? Like, what is wrong with them mentally to think that this is okay in their mind? And it's usually very successful people, which is just, I don't even know how to say it, but like, how did they become so effed up?
So the number one driver around trafficking and exploitation is pornography. So most buyers have an addiction to pornography, so that visualization then leads to actualization, right? And so what they've been seeing in images and just, culturally, so much has gone towards this glamorizing of the sex industry. And so what is really challenging is that, again, it's part of it is a cultural piece, right? Part of it is just where society is at. And I think that until we start addressing the pornography issue that we have that's rampant, not only in the US, but around the globe, it's really a hard conversation. When you look at places where they've been more successful in dealing with the issue of trafficking, you look at countries like Sweden, and the Nordic model really helped to eliminate some of the challenges, which was that they targeted the buyers. Like, those who were caught buying were held accountable and they were exposed. And whether it was in a paper, whether it was, in a magazine, whether it was on the news, they were exposed that, hey, this person was found doing this. Because right now it's hidden, right? So you can do all these things, and it's not, and you have a population of survivors and victims whose voices have been silenced. And so no one's believing them, right? At large. And so part of it is, if they were to come forward, who would believe? Because so many people don't even know that this issue exists, right?
Yeah, because you say it starts with pornography. I would say that the majority of people I know watch pornography, but it's adult pornography. So why do you think that adult pornography leads to this sick, twisted desire to be sexual with a child?
Well, you'd be surprised, because there's a lot of people who watch child pornography that you would
I thought
never.
that was pretty locked down. I mean, you're hearing more that
You can still get to it, and oftentimes what can be deemed as adult is actually underage girls who are put in those positions. Is anyone checking IDs? Is the people watching it checking IDs? No. And oftentimes these traffickers will utilize these youth in pornography before putting them out on the street or selling them for dates.
Yeah, because I remember the Subway guy.
Yeah.
Jared, he's in jail because he was caught. So why do you think some people are caught and put away, as they should be, but not everybody's caught? And how are we allowing this sick pornography, this type of underage pornography online, when they're easily pulling people that disagree with them online, pulling their platforms off, but yet we can't fix this sick web of child pornography? I mean, nothing makes sense in this world anymore.
It doesn't. And that's what's sad, is you have to look at who is being caught using this stuff and doing these things. And it's a lot of powerful people who have a lot of money. And so, there's ways to bribe and pay things off. The internet is, while it's amazing, it has a lot of challenges in and of itself. I mean, the regulation side, we don't have enough enforcement, because, our law enforcement guys are and gals are doing the best that they can, you know, and these cases take a long time to develop and investigate. And so, you know, and some of it is different jurisdictions have different priorities, right? So, you know, not always is this front and center. It's a hard issue to tackle, and it really takes a community-wide response, which is one of the things that with the organization Hoola Na Pua that I built and founded, you know, we really identified the need for prevention work, for intervention work, for that reintegration and healing piece. But that really, it requires this systemic shift, right? So you've got to address buying, you've got to address selling, you've got to address the fact that so many people don't even know that this is happening, right? And so those are the same people who vote. Those are the same people who, you know, are leading in a community. And if they didn't know that this issue was this prevalent, then you one have to make them aware, because then there has to be systemic structural shifting that happens so that kids can be protected. But again, it's operated in this dark, seedy place for a really long time. And yet now it's being exposed. And it's actually a really exciting time in this work, because I can tell you over the last decade plus, it's such an easier conversation to have because more people are aware that it happens. And that it's not just kids from other countries or women and men from other countries. We're talking about American born individuals who are being exploited.
Because I think it was when Epstein was finally put away. I mean, he was arrested previously, and it was seemed like it was swept under the rug, and he was just let off or bought his way off, and then he got arrested again. And then it wasn't until, was it 2017, 2018 that they finally put the sicko away. And then that really kind of raised awareness. And then all the girls that came forward and the people that were named on this flight list of what were they doing with this guy. You know, you've got now a very public divorce with Bill Gates and his wife. And one of the reasons that was stated in the news was she was very uncomfortable with his relationship with Epstein. Why, is one of the richest, most powerful people in the world, would you be associating with a pedophile? And so you kind of go to, well, what did he have on Bill Gates that kept Bill coming back? You know, and obviously you don't want to accuse somebody of something so horrific until you have proof. But you kind of wonder, why were these people hanging out with somebody like this? And are they involved? We don't know.
Yep, we absolutely don't know. You know, and again, all that stuff has to be looked into and seen for the truth that you know, whatever elements of truth are there.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that when in all the decade plus that I've been doing this, the wake of destruction that it causes on these children's lives is pretty significant. And I think, like, to come back to the humanness, right, of the preciousness and innocence of a child. And, you know, our average age that our kids are trafficked are 11 years old in the state of Hawaii. It's about 14 years old in the rest of the country. So these are young. These are kids that are young, you know, and 3 out of 4 victims knew their trafficker. So oftentimes people go, oh, who is it? The guy who crawled out from under the bridge? I'm like, no, it's somebody who makes this child believe that they have value, purpose, creates a relationship, and little do they know what they're getting into. And so once these kids are involved, it's really hard for them to get out. And when the systems have not historically been set up to help these youth get out of these tough situations, that's why we've had so many kids that have gone unrecognized. And so now you're starting to see across the country, there is shifting across most states and in most cities, where at least we're starting to see more task forces, more response systems put into place, right? And like, there's been more conversation on a government level around this issue. But again, you know, not everywhere this is a priority. And I can tell you, this issue happens in cities and villages and towns and rural communities across the United States. And if for 1 second anyone listening thinks that it doesn't happen in their town, I don't care how small it is, it does. And oftentimes it's family who exploit their kids. for drug money, for rent money. So it's not just the trafficker who is always deemed as like this outside person, but in fact, it happens in the home, and it can start in the home.
Isn't that unbelievable? But yeah, I remember I had Jaco Booyens. I'm not sure if
Mm,
you're familiar with him. He does a lot of anti-sex trafficking
mm,
work. And his sister was a victim of it. And when they
mm,
were in Africa, she was a pop singer and single
mm,
mother. And the manager basically said, "Oh, don't worry. If you have to work, I'll pick her up and take her to all her events." And she was on this past fall. But she was trafficked by her manager, and she was still going home every
mhm,
night, but her brother and her mother's lives were threatened, so she couldn't say anything, so she felt like she was trapped and she couldn't get out. But Yako was saying when he was on the podcast that he was talking about a very wealthy town in Dallas, Texas, and I forgot what the name was, but it happens in that neighborhood. I think
mhm,
there's not a house under
mhm.
$2 million in that neighborhood. I think the
Yep.
Bushes live there. And so it's like it doesn't have to just be a poor community. It's
No,
a lot of rich
no.
communities.
It crosses
Unbelievable.
all socioeconomic statuses. I mean, and that's where the education is so important, because again, we build up these assumptions in our minds of what it looks like. You watch the movie Taken.
Yeah.
Hey, that was a good movie. That does happen, but the reality is that's not how it happens all the time. And oftentimes, these individuals, these youth are recruited online, right? Through like social media and through all this access they have to online platforms. And so it's not this kidnapping, right? Like that definitely happens, but that's not the common way that people end up being exploited. It's usually through somebody who they think is a trusted person, and obviously has other plans for them.
And so these traffickers are, I mean, I've read something like it's an $800 billion industry.
Yeah, I don't even know what it's up to now, but it's like the fastest growing, criminal activity
Do we have
in the
that many
world.
sick, demented people walking this planet? I mean, it's unbelievable.
Unfortunately, yes. I mean, and I think with COVID and the pandemic, it's just going to get worse, because when people get desperate, they do anything, right? And unfortunately, when you have a vulnerable population, which can be very vulnerable, individuals who are struggling to survive are vulnerable, it's easy to exploit. I mean, I think that this is the very untouched conversation around COVID-19. Is it's like we're all worried about a virus, but I'm looking at the exploitation that continues to increase. I mean, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported a 90% increase in their cyber tip line for online exploitation of children during 2020. And, we're not hearing about that on the news, and
Why do
we
you
should.
think that is?
I think because kids have been online all the time. They've been locked in their house and quarantine and, in lockdowns. And these predators are out there, and they're able to get into all these avenues that kids have access to.
So why do you
And
think the media is not covering it?
I'm just not sure. I'm actually not sure why. I think that there's always a
Because that's a
hesitancy with this
much
issue.
human trafficking is a much bigger virus than COVID.
Yeah,
But
yes, it is.
somehow that's all they were covering, and they're not covering this,
Hmm.
which makes me a
Hmm.
little suspicious. Like, well, what's going on?
Yeah,
Why are we not talking about this?
right.
Because
Well, I think it's a tough issue that a lot of people don't necessarily want to talk about, and it's
we don't want
also
to hear
not a
it because it's so
priority.
disturbing.
Yep. I mean, I will speak across the country on multiple platforms in front of thousands of people, and they will all still come up to me afterwards and say, "Wow, that's so sad what happens to those women." And I'm like, "You mean the children?" Like I think our brains have a hard time comprehending that this happens to kids. And not that it's any less if it happens to an adult, but the reality when we're talking 11, 12, 13 years old,
I
it
know.
is something that we just cannot continue to look away from. And we have to continue to expose it and have conversation and tell kids about their risk and educate them and educate parents on how to help their kids know how to use their cell phones appropriately and who are they talking to. I mean,
Yeah.
there's just so many layers. And, and there's clearly a generational divide, right? Because there's so much access. I mean, the average age that a kid gets a smartphone now is 9 years old.
It's too young.
It's too young.
It
That's
just
like handing your
seems remarkable.
15-year-old the keys to your car and you didn't teach them how to drive.
Yeah, I know. It's so just disturbing. But let's talk about the foster care system because that's where a lot of these victims come
Mm,
out of as well, because they don't
yes.
have that parental protection and there's just not enough resources to guide them. Um, and then they're thrown out on the streets at 18 years old.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
a lot of them lead into prostitution or drug use because of it,
Mm-hmm.
not having that
Abs-
proper nurturing. But that's where a lot of these kind of trafficked victims seem to come from as well.
Yes, no, it absolutely is. I mean, being in foster care, you're vulnerable, right? You're the lack of attachment, connections, multiple placements. And oftentimes, like these kids have a lot of trauma, right? And so their behaviors can make them seem like they're not being compliant or they want to fight the foster parent or whatever. But behavior is the language of trauma. And so oftentimes it's really hard for these kids to stay in one place and feel safe enough to even begin to start to process it, and a lot of them haven't received intensive intervention or treatment or anything addressing that. And I mean, we have kids that we've worked with who were abused, exploited in a foster home, and so it's just the vulnerability that comes from being in foster care. It just can't be understated, and I think sometimes it can be deemed that, oh, you should be happy you have a home. And it's like, hey, everybody wants to be loved and accepted. And when these kids are able to build a healthy attachment and relationship, I mean, that's everything. That's the biggest prevention piece.
Absolutely. So tell us about your organization because it's if you guys are tuned into the video on YouTube, you can kind of see in her background um, the area. So what kind of work do you guys do there to help these kids in Hawaii?
Yeah, so our organization is committed to preventing child sex trafficking and providing care for children who've been exploited. And so we looked at what was happening in the community, which really stemmed from looking at what was or wasn't happening nationally. And we built a whole bunch of community-based programs. So we have a mentoring program, an advocacy program. We do a lot of group resiliency work in the youth corrections and juvenile detention settings, short-term shelters. We do a lot of prevention education in the schools and training for professionals, not even just in Hawaii. We do huge webinars that get global attendance because they're free. And we talk about the issue of trafficking, trauma work, what it looks like to work with the population. But one of the big things I saw early on was the need for comprehensive residential treatment.
Okay.
Because in 2009, when I first started, there was only 50 beds for children who'd been sex trafficked in the United States of America.
What?
Now, 50, 50, 50.
Where
Now
where were
there's
the
a
beds? Just in like hospitals or foster care?
So there, no, so when we say residential treatment beds, so those are specialized beds for this population. So it could be a small program of like 16 beds. It could be in a hospital-based setting, but it was just very, kind of random. Now there's about 600 residential treatment beds for kids who've been trafficked. However, in the United States, there's around 100,000 children that are trafficked every year. So there's a huge need to build a model of care for the comprehensive treatment, healing of body, mind, spirit, and emotion for underage kids who've been exploited. Because again, their trauma is so severe and it doesn't just get fixed in a 30-day program.
No. And do you finally get them to report these bastards so we can lock them up?
So some of what we just focus on the relationship aspect and building relationship so that they feel safe. and it's always their choice. And we empower them that if they want to come forward and say something, then we'll connect them with law enforcement that we've built relationships with, that we trust, so that they feel safe enough to disclose. Most times, victims won't disclose. It's very rare for them to fully disclose because they just don't feel safe. So part of our job is to make sure that they feel safe and give them and empower them to come forward. We never force them, we never make them do any of that. But if they want that, then we absolutely do that. So we built a residential treatment program called Pearl Haven. It's a 32-bed comprehensive campus, and the kids receive schooling on site. The girls do. So it's for teenage girls. It's again, they get on-site schooling, mental health care. We're building animal-assisted programming. We have life skill development. We're on a beautiful 13-acre piece of property with a 24,000 square foot facility. I mean, it's just absolutely beautiful, serene, healing. And it's a miracle how we even developed it, because, you know, land is about $1 million an acre in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And I had looked for 3 years. And then in 2014, I found out there was a piece of property owned by the state. They were looking for someone to take over a long-term land lease on an asset that was probably close to $20 million. The facility was totally destroyed. It had originally been a high-risk boys' home, and then it transitioned to a convalescent home, then sat vacant for 10 years and just got destroyed. And so there was 3 competing entities, and we went before the state land board and said, look, there's nowhere for these kids to go. We don't have a treatment program. We were locking them up. We were putting them in short-term shelters. We were sending them to treatment programs that weren't specific to their trafficking exploitation experience. And so we were granted a minimum of a 30-year lease on this amazing piece of property for less than $500 a year.
That's amazing.
And so it was amazing. I mean, the amount of community support that came around us. We had close to $1 million of design and engineering work donated. And we just finished renovation at the beginning of this year, and are licensed and have our Medicaid number. And I mean, it's this amazing state-of-the-art facility that has been uniquely designed for these kids.
That's amazing. And so do kids come to you that are looking to be rescued, or do you find them? Like, how do...
So that's part of, over the last 10 years, we've worked really hard to educate, you know, the child welfare, juvenile justice system, law enforcement systems to recognize, identify, and then we can receive referrals from any entity. So it could be from parents, it could be from, you know, again, the child welfare, juvenile justice system. We always say we don't rescue kids. Law enforcement rescues kids. We help with the, you know, bringing healing of their complex trauma. You know, and oftentimes we find with these kids, because we work in so many community settings, we know a lot of these kids from multiple other programs. So we also work with other nonprofits in our space. And even nationally, we get the word out. We're part of some networks of providers to make sure that kids have access to care. And ultimately, we want to be sharing best practice, right, with each other. So we work hard to collaborate, because there's so much room for more growth and development, because like we talked about, you know, it's not a lot of people who've known about the issue. And so we're really excited to be pioneering along with our other, you know, colleagues in the space. I mean, it's really a tremendous opportunity to help kids. Yeah.
So
absolutely.
for the listeners, what are some signs that people should be aware of to recognize if somebody's being trafficked?
So, you know, when you think about it from an adult standpoint, right? If you're thinking about adults being exploited, it's really, depending on where you live, looking at, you know, what is the living situation? Are there a lot of people coming and going? You know, or do you live in an apartment complex and you're like, something weird is happening in apartment 205? You know, seeing a lot of, you know, perhaps men coming and going from a facility or a business, you know, understanding what your kids are doing online. Who are they talking to? What kind of conversations? Are they all of a sudden starting to have brand new purse, getting their hair done, getting their nails done, having items that you're like, hey, this doesn't seem right. Like, I'm not buying this for them.
Yeah.
Changes in behavior, right? Changes in behavior. When you're out and about in the community and you're driving around and you see something that doesn't look that like it just, you're like, hey, that looks off. There's this young girl and this older guy, or a young boy and this older guy, and you're like, hey, something doesn't seem right. That's why we always tell people, if you see something, you got to say something. It doesn't mean you're assuming. It just means that, you never know. Like, you
So
could be
say
seeing.
something. What do you say something to maybe
So,
a conversation with the child and be like, oh, is this your dad?
so it
Or,
just depends. I mean, obviously you don't want to put yourself in harm's way just in case. But you could always say, hey, are you doing okay? I mean, you look at what's happened like on airplane flights, right? A flight attendant sees a young girl with a guy, and she sees, wow, he seems really controlling. And she, starts talking to the young person, and the young person's going, I can't get out of this situation, or whatever they said, in that moment. And that led to law enforcement being there when the plane lands and they intercept a situation. So, so there's those kind of instances. But I always tell community people that you can try to call 911, but oftentimes that doesn't really lead necessarily to a response. But however, now we have the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which it gets, no matter where you are in the US, it gets routed to that local law enforcement that they have a relationship with. And those tips that come in, they're anonymous, but oftentimes it can lead to an actual break in a case, because again, it's like, you look at, the flyers, the missing kid flyers that are on the walls, right, at Walmart, used to be on milk cartons. Like, it took community members going, hey, I think I saw that person. I think I saw that kid.
yep.
And realizing that a lot of those kids that you see on those posters, a lot of those are kids who end up in trafficking and exploitation situations.
It's
And so being aware of
wow.
your surroundings, being aware of situations that don't, seem to be normal, are really, really, really important, to be looking at. I'm trying to see.
So when these kids so usually are they living at home, or when they're trafficked, they're kidnapped and living in a certain facility, or
So it can look a lot of different ways. You can actually have kids who are trafficked and they go home every day. They can be trafficked after school. Sometimes the trafficker, the pimp, will have blackmail on them, right? And so they'll say, hey, you sent me these naked photos of yourself, and I know your dad's an attorney, and do you want this to get out? So instead, you got to do this for me. You do have kids that go missing, right? They go on the run. They might be staying with the pimp in a hotel or a condo or at his house or that kind of thing. You can have, again, because there are so many kids that are in the, foster involved system, not everyone always has tabs on those kids, right? So who's looking for them? And so, it can look a lot of different ways. And again, you can be kidnapped, but that's much more rare. That we see here in the US.
so it's just so crazy this even goes on. And it's been going
Yeah.
on since what, the beginning of time?
It's been, they say, somebody said to me, oh, prostitution um, is the like oldest profession. And I'm like, no, it's the oldest form of slavery that we have. People go, oh, well, she's an adult, like she's choosing this. And you got to realize like 90% of women in the research don't want to be in the sex industry. And the majority of them have a trafficker and an exploiter, and they're not keeping the money. They're being forced to do it. They're being frauded. I don't even know if that's a word. There's fraud involved and coercion, right? And
So they're
so,
not even getting
and if,
paid.
yeah, and if you were trafficked as a kid and that's all just because you turn 18 and are an adult doesn't mean all of a sudden you're no longer a victim.
Right. No, absolutely.
And you have movies like Pretty Woman, which it romanticizes what this life looks like. And it is so far from that. Like
No,
that is
it's not.
not how this
So,
life is,
yeah. So let's
you know?
go to the border, because we are in a crazy border crisis, and it's just that they're saying there's all these youth down there, and they're just being housed in horrible conditions, and a lot of them are unaccompanied minors,
Mhm.
that have no parents, they and then there's also stories where, people will come up to the border and drop the kids off and just say, you know what, we're trying to do what's best for you. You're on your own. And then the parents go back to Mexico, and the kids are left to fend for themselves. But they're saying this is
Mhm.
where a lot of trafficking takes place.
When
So,
you think about the kids coming up all the way from South America, through Central America, through Mexico, and whether they're with an adult, whether they are not with an adult, eh, they are being put into situations of survival. And there are many people wanting to exploit them on that journey up to the border. So you think about all that abuse that's happened. And then once they are here, then the risk, right, and the vulnerabilities that are there, it's the perfect hunting ground for traffickers to take kids that have no system involvement yet, per our system,
right.
and are really at risk for, being exploited, whether it's sexually, whether it's through drugs, whether it's whatever it is. I mean, it's a huge challenge that we're facing, and that we can't take lightly. I mean, there are people who are wanting to profit off the innocence of our children.
It's just mind boggles you. Like, how do people get so deranged?
Yeah,
Like, what goes
it
on
is.
that?
But it's driven by money. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a profitable business. Whether you're the parent, whether you're the trafficker, or whoever it is that's exploiting the individual, they're getting something out of this happening to a child, to a young adult. And that I think is just, that's what's so incredibly sad, is that we are okay, that people can be okay with that. But you think about the brokenness that they come from themselves.
Yeah. So why do you think it is that so many powerful people seem to be involved in this when they have all
Um,
the money in the world? Is it a power thing? Is it something that?
I think there's elements of power. I think our society has over sexualized young girls. And I look at all the movies and the commercials, and everything is filled with sex. I mean, I'm sorry, but it really is. Like, there is so much out there. And so, I think that there's the power dynamics, there's the money dynamics, there's the control. And I think that our kids are becoming more and more vulnerable through so many facets. Even coming from solid homes, there's still vulnerability. And when you know how to prey on that, when you look at that, most kids want to spend the majority of their time on YouTube trying to become an influencer, trying to have, millions of photos of themselves with all the filters, and it's, so the value we've placed on a human life has just, it's just gone. I mean, it's increased in the trafficking world, but from an ethics, perspective, we've decreased the value. And we're just basically saying it's another way to make a profit. It's another way to get, to make myself feel more powerful, more in control. And I think it's just really sad, really devastating and sad.
Devastating, it's disgusting, it's
And the accountability isn't there. So the reality is for years people have gotten away with this.
well, it's like the
And
whole thing
so,
with it's like the whole thing with Epstein, right? The flight logs are released. Giselle, whatever the heck her name is, nobody knows, is
mhm,
in jail. The trial's going on, but yet they've done documentaries on it. They've had names. They've
mhm,
had victims come forward and talk about it, but yet nothing has happened to these other
yeah,
people that were involved.
mhm,
Why
mhm,
do you think
yeah.
that is? Why are
I
they?
think people are protected. I think people, money can silence a lot of things. And, I mean, in the University of Chicago, they did a study on people who buy sex, and the two big deterrents for getting people to stop doing that was that their significant other would find out, and that it would be exposed to the people they work with. So if you know that that is a deterrent, the more you can keep it silent, the more it's going to continue, the more you're not going to be held accountable. And so, I mean, that, I'm sorry, money talks.
I know it does. It's unfortunate. Money is a great tool for amazing things, but unfortunately it can be used for some very horrific things as well.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that there's a lot of shame, and when you think about what keeps the kids in these situations of not being able to get out, it's the shame, because it's like, oh my gosh, like they in their mind, I chose this, I made a bad decision. It's like they can't choose to be in this. The federal law states that if you're under the age of 18, you can't choose to be in the sex industry. And so the shame keeps them in bondage. But I also think there's shame on behalf of those who are buying. And I think when you're in this place and you're struggling and you really don't know who to turn to and you have this dirty secret, there's shame. And so you're just going to keep trying to keep it hidden. And it's like this lie that just continues to fester. And I think it's just sad. I mean, honestly, my heart is broken for all of it, because I can't just be angry at the people who do this, right? Because whoever's doing this is doing it from a place of brokenness. And so what happened in their life that led them down this path, and yes, it needs to be held accountable by all means. I have the biggest justice gene in my DNA, but I also see that, look at the societal component to this, and you've recognized it, you've identified it in our conversation, it's like everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, thank God it's being talked about more. You don't hear about it enough in the news.
Yeah.
But hopefully that will change.
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, we are going to keep shining that light. And I think, again, the more we talk about it, the less shame will be associated with it, because people will feel empowered to come forward. I think for years, again, these individuals have had their voices silent because they were afraid to come forward, that no one would believe them. And to any survivors that might be listening to this, I want you to know that we see you and we hear you and we believe you, and you've got to say something, because it is time. It is a new day in this country, and there's an army that's rising up to protect kids and to make sure that these kids have a bright future.
Thank God. Yeah. And it's the more people that, know about it and are aware of it can really make an impact.
Yeah,
to stop.
Absolutely.
You've also written some interesting articles that I read. And one of them was, most of the stuff that we buy comes from overseas factories, and we don't really know exactly what's going on in those factories, and that there are human trafficking victims there too, but there's also forced child labor. And so you had a very interesting article about slave-free closets, and essentially how to make sure that what the items that you're buying in your closet are not produced by child labor. So can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so it's really important. I think people just don't even realize, before I started really getting into this work, I wasn't really aware of just
Right,
the level of, exactly.
Yeah.
So really understanding and researching where clothing items from well-known stores are actually sourced from, and trying to find things that have what they call the free trade emblem on there, so that that it wasn't used. You're starting to see it in like coffee companies and chocolate companies where it'll say,
what does it look like?
Yeah, trade. I'd have to Google it to show it, but there's a free trade logo that you can see, and it basically is depicting that there is no, it's not a trafficking situation. And I can tell you, when I was in Cambodia and when I was in Cameroon, Africa, and seeing, a lot of where these places are, where there's these productions going on, they're basically paying these kids nothing. And they're working 14 to 16 hours a day. I mean, I went to a brick factory in Cambodia, and it's like they feed the kids every other day. I mean, it's crazy. And they were sold into this by family because family has debt to pay off. They owe the brick factory owner. And, unfortunately, it's led to just this enormous amount of exploitation, and kids are cheap, free labor, essentially. And so you look at, a lot of times these families don't even know what they're doing, because there's just, you're talking about a village in Cambodia or some remote place in Thailand, and they're being told, oh, your kid's going to go to school and they're going to have a good job, and they don't know. So I really encourage people to look at, what are you buying, how are you buying it, where are you buying it from? And when you really do start to source things, you'll find it is more expensive. It is. It is. When you're finding things that are not produced in labor intensive, by child labor, it's going to be more expensive, as it should be, right?
Of
And
course.
so, but I think we have to be mindful. And, there's a lot of good resources online, when you're looking at trying to buy products that, are really sourced well. And again, slave labor isn't used, and you'd be so surprised how prevalent it is. Everyone has an iPhone or some sort of smartphone,
Yeah.
and components in that are mined and labored from Africa. And you have tons of kids who are being used to mine that stuff. And so,
So
do we all want to get rid of our phones? You start to go,
yeah,
when you start
right.
going down that path, is like, what are we willing to sacrifice
So
to
you
take
had
a stand?
you had another interesting article that you'd written too, of how companies, like what they can do to ensure that they don't have child labor. Because a lot of these companies will start, right? Let's say I had an idea for a sweat, like a sweatshirt company. I wanted to make these sweatshirts, and I know that if I go to, Africa, I can make them cheap, and then I come back with a good profit. How do I
Mhm.
ensure that they're not using forced labor in that facility? Because it starts with the
So
companies. They
it
need to
does.
understand and go
It
there,
does.
research, and figure out,
Yes.
okay, is a company that I'm building and saying we're selling these things and we're making a profit and we're doing good for the community and we're hiring these people, but yet we're using slave labor? Like, how do they ensure that they're not going down this path?
So you definitely have to be asking a lot of questions, and you have to, it's hard now, I know, because of COVID, but there really has to be those boots on the ground looking at how it's set up and what's happening. But even if it's not overseas, there's labor trafficking that's happening right here in the US,
Yeah.
that you're seeing in cities. You see it a lot in the restaurant industry, right? Where restaurant and hotels, there can be those trafficking pieces there. So it's really asking a lot of questions. Where is all this stuff being sourced from? Having actual, um, you're seeing actual physical files or electronic files of, like, okay, how exactly are you walking through this process? Whether you're sourcing something, whether it's coming from another connection that you have to get X, Y, and Z. It's really, you have to do the work, you have to do the legwork, and you can't assume that it's all good. Like, I don't know how else to say it. It's just, you can't assume, and you have to take the time, because it's much easier for systems to be set up to exploit than it is for systems to be set up to protect.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's good that companies hopefully are aware, and then,
Hmm.
consumers obviously take a stance too by looking for that free trade logo,
Yeah,
instead of just
exactly.
buying what you like necessarily, maybe taking some time, because that's how you can make an
Yeah,
impact
to look.
as well.
Yep. And research, and take the time, because it could save a life. And you got to think of it that way, right? And
Exactly.
I think the more people that start talking about this, and we start demanding change, then there'll be change across
Hmm.
the country, around the globe, But when
Absolutely.
we go with convenience, convenience has a price.
It
And
does.
that price is human life.
Yeah. So hopefully, like, more people will kind of be aware of what's going on, and
Mhm.
things will hopefully take a change for the better. And I think a lot of this is now really coming out heavily, and people are, you know, maybe saying, "Gosh, the world is such a dark, ugly, evil place." But the truth is, it kind of always has been. It's just
Mhm.
now but it's also a good place. But the evil that's been going on has been hidden for so long. And,
Yep.
I think it's good that people know it's being exposed, because it can't be stopped until it's exposed. So don't
Yeah.
turn a blind eye to these
Yep.
conversations. See if you've got
Mhm.
some time where you can kind of get involved and help. And that leads
And
me
there's
to,
hope. There's
yeah,
hope,
there is. And
you
we
know.
can make the world a better place one step at a time and one
Mhm.
awareness at a time. And so that
Yep.
leads me to, where can everybody kind of find you and donate to your organization so they can help if they choose to?
Yeah. So our website is www.HOOLANAPUA.org.
Okay.
Um, we can be found online. Our phone number is 808-445-3131. We're predominantly privately funded, so we do a ton of fundraising. Any amount helps, so it doesn't matter if it's $5 or $20. We've built the organization that way, and we're impacting thousands of lives a year with all of our community-based programs, with our reach. You can also check out, we did an episode with Hawaii Five-0,
Oh,
with the
nice.
CBS, and yeah, so in 2017, season 7, episode 19, was the episode that we worked with them on, talking about the issue of trafficking of children and what it looks like. And so I would encourage everyone to tune in. It's a very educational. It's not
I
based in
gotta watch
Hollywood.
it. Okay, cool.
It's really good. So, and you can always reach out to me. My email is jessica.munoz@hoolanapua.org.
Okay. And
And
you
I would
guys,
love to hear.
everything will be, all the links and everything will be on the website at
Yeah.
nexttomadison.com under episode 106. So you can easily find that out, and you can do some more research yourself, or reach out and donate and kind of see how you can get involved. But again, it's a very touchy subject. Nobody wants to talk about it because it gives you that ooh factor. Um, but it's very important that we are all aware so we can make this world a much better place, and to protect the vulnerable, which are the children who really don't have a voice for themselves. So thank you for
Yes.
doing the work you're doing. You're an angel. It's remarkable.
Thank you for having me and allowing me to use my voice to share with the community that loves to listen to what you have to say.
Yes, well, thank you. And you guys listening wherever you're at, I appreciate you tuning in to another episode of Next to Madison. And we'll see you next time to find out who's next.
Hey, your host here, Madison Malloy. Please make sure to subscribe to the show on all podcast platforms, and please rate and review us on iTunes and Spotify. Also, if you have any questions or comments, you can email us at contact@nexttomadison.com. I thank you again for listening. Bye.